86 years old and constantly involved in things. And it gets to this question that I talked about last night on the Sublime. And I just wanted to give you a couple of ideas from Beethoven about how you take up this question of what do you do when you're in a dead culture? How do you change a dead culture? What has to be the internal thought process? And this gets right at the question of doing the music work. So we were just discussing with Matthew this idea that you are always open to seeing something differently. No matter, Bergonzi once said this. He said, I can sing a song over and over and over, and then something will happen and I'll get a flash of insight and I'll say, why not try it this way? And Lynn describes that also with Bryneen. That Norbert Bryneen and the Amadeus Quartet, who played over and over and over for 40 years, they'd sit down and they'd look for something new in one of the Mozart quartets and say, let's try it again. Let's look at it again. So this is the benefit of classical music. Now think about this. Imagine we didn't have classical music and you listened again and again and again to something by 50 cents. 50 cents. Which people do. You see them, still on the TV. They're like this, they've heard it 100 times. What are they missing that they're going to get the next time they hear it? But every time, just as an example, in preparing for the class yesterday, I went back through Homer. I couldn't read the whole Iliad the night before I left. But what had happened to me is that I smushed it all together so that I had this idea that the Iliad actually included the story of the Trojan horse and you basically end with Agamemnon coming back. And then I realized from looking at it, it ends with Achilles and Priam. And that's powerful because up to that point, it's all blood and gore and vengeance and killing and ego states and rage. And then it ends on this beautiful note of Achilles reflecting on what it means that he just killed the son, the beloved son of Priam. And this sense that it was going to happen to him. So Achilles doesn't get killed in the Iliad. And I always, in my mind, then I realize it's because this becomes, as Lynn points out in the Saturday talks yesterday, that most of Aeschylus comes out of the extended story of the Iliad. That these histories and mythology become a one in shaping the way we think. So you always find new things. And after I had read some of these articles by Helga on the Sublime, and then I went back to Homer and I said, wow, this is a sublime moment at the end of the Iliad. So it's this question of constantly discovering and rediscovering. So I had a bit of an epiphany the other night. It was a warm kind of blocked Saturday in Los Angeles. We had basically a 12-hour war with the phone team. And Phil and I were trying to figure out what can we talk to them about that we haven't already talked to them about. What's in the Saturday talks? What did Lynn give us that's new? What's going on in the world? What do we have? And it just, nothing really seemed to work. And it was a Sunday night, the next night, and we were in the office till 6 p.m. Sunday. And it's one of these nights where you just don't feel like you've accomplished much. On top of that, I had been away from Susan. I was thinking about her, and so I didn't know what to do, and I was wandering through this new area of Glendale. They've built this monstrosity called the Americana on Brand. And it's this super luxurious condominiums on top of the Cheesecake Factory and 27 movie theater in one complex, and stores that no one shops in. Where they have ripped blue jeans for $137 and, things like that. So I was getting more and more depressed. And so I went home, and in Glendale, one of the few things I have is I have the Furtwängler conducting the Beethoven symphonies. And I started listening to the Eighth Symphony. And all of a sudden, all these, I was saying, what a blocked idiot I'm being. And I listened to this twice, and then you probably know that Mihua and I have regular communication. And so I sent off an email to her on some of what I was thinking. And I had picked up a book of Beethoven quotes from his Tagebuch, his daily book, because when he lost his hearing, he would communicate by writing. And he has these books where he has these tablets where he just writes. And he says, in one of them, like Johanna, Joan of Arc, I go nowhere without my banner. With her, it's carrying the flag of France. With him, it's carrying his notebooks. So he has all these wonderful thoughts, and you see the way it's shaped by Schiller. And what's he thinking about? He lived in a dead culture. 1819, they banned the performance of Schiller plays in Austria. This is Count Metternich had taken over after the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna, which Lynn sometimes calls the Sexual Congress of Vienna. Because what happened was Metternich basically hired prostitutes from all over the Europe to come to Vienna. You had all these diplomats from Russia, from Britain, from France, from all of Europe, to figure out how to establish a consolidated British imperial control using the Prussian military, Austrian secret police, and British finance. And part of what they did is they literally had a sexual congress, where about half of the Russian delegation went back with a sexually transmitted disease, which in Russian, the proper name of it is Ratchakakov. And so they had this. They used the courtesans to spy on people, and literally all the Russian diplomats came back with syphilis to Russia. So in the meantime, what did they do? They established the top-down control, and one of the things they said is, we're going to change everything about the culture. We're not going to allow Schiller, because Schiller had been key. Schiller died in 1805, but his plays were performed in the camp when the Prussian military under Baron von Stein had a mobilization to throw out the French. They had a reorganization of Prussia. Wilhelm von Humboldt was involved in this. Gneisenau and Scharnhorst were the military leaders. And they organized the military to rise up and throw out Napoleon. And in the campgrounds, they performed Wallenstein. They read Schiller's poetry. The soldiers, the Prussian soldiers. And they had a profound sense of the moral struggle at this point for the nation. And so this was a great threat to the British. So the British had to get the Kaiser instead to focus on control. And they basically said to him, if you don't crush this, you're going to lose the country. The Austrians at that time, I can't remember which was the Austrian emperor, but he was completely under the control of Count Metternich and the Austrian nobility. And so their whole idea was, we've got to change the culture. So what did they do? They raised the tuning. The Russian bands came in. And, the Russians were always a little backward on these things. So here you had in the European culture shaped by Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, and to some extent the young Schubert. And the Russian bands came in playing at A at 452. It was high, but it was brass bands. The Russian soldiers looked pretty good. And everyone said, isn't this exciting? And they used this as an excuse to up the tuning. They said, it's brighter, it sounds better, it's less melancholy. And so here's Beethoven in Vienna at this time, watching the spectacle, invited to some of the soirees, and he was, Beethoven was not the kind of guy who liked to just hang out and gossip. He liked to know what was going on. But he was concerned with more profound things. And he watched Vienna collapse. The people who had been his circle, who had also been the Mozart circle, like Lichnowsky, Count and Countess Thun, the Mendelssohn family, the people who had been there with Mozart and with Beethoven, the people that later show up in this work that David Shaven's doing on Dirichlet and these broader networks, Count Lichnowsky, Razumovsky. They all left. They went back to Russia or Poland. And so Vienna became a cultural desert. And so here Beethoven was struggling with the most profound musical ideas, and he lost his audience. And what they liked instead was the razzmatazz of Rossini. And so Beethoven was quite depressed. And this was the second time this had happened. Earlier, some of you know, I didn't get a chance to bring this in for today, but you probably are familiar with the Heiligenstadt Testament, where Beethoven first comes to terms with the fact that he's going to lose his hearing. He's not going to get better. That he tried various things, like he had a piano with the legs cut off. So the piano would actually be on the floor, so he would put his head on the floor to see if he could pick up the vibrations to hear the sound. He had this crazy, these horns, the early hearing aids. None of it worked because it was a obstruction that basically destroyed his hearing. So in 1802, he wrote this letter to his two brothers where he's basically saying, I'm going to kill myself because I, as a musician, hearing is the one faculty I should have better than anything else. And yet I can't hear the shepherd's flute in the distance. I can't hear musical notes. And then he starts talking about the importance of music. And then he comes back with this powerful thing about, I will live for my music. So if you're not familiar with this, if you go to the Thayer biography of Beethoven, the Heiligenstadt Testament, or it's pretty much available. I'm sure you can find it online. It's a beautiful statement of a self-conscious artist saying, I will live for my art, what I can leave to everyone else. Now, in 1812, as Beethoven was losing this, as the Vienna emptied out, it was a city under siege, he began to reflect on this question of what was important to him. What should he do? What did it mean to be a dedicated artist? And so he wrote in his book in 1812, before my departure for the Elysian fields, I must leave behind me what the eternal spirit has infused into my soul and bids me complete. Why? I feel as if I had hardly composed more than a few notes. So this is in 1812. Then he went on to say that, unfortunately, he doesn't expect divine intervention to help him live longer. And like Homer, I understand that to men are allotted but a few days. And he said, while I hoped for fame and praise and eternal life, he knew that his time would be short. So he concluded in this letter and said, he must therefore reject a shiftless life, which I often pictured to myself. And he said, instead I find happiness through art. And he said, live only in your art, for you are so limited by your senses. This is nevertheless the only existence for you. So for him, art was lifting you outside of your senses. So even then it was clear that he had the sense that as you lose your hearing, you still have this capacity to hear. Now, he then wrote, everything that is called life should be sacrificed to the sublime and be a sanctuary of art. And later he said, sacrifice once and for all the trivialities of social life to your art. Now, he continued to compose and do things, but after 1815, it tailed off a bit. And then 1818, 1819, he was caught up in the battle to win over custody of his nephew. His nephew was kind of a mixed bag. But one of the things his nephew did is he sent his nephew to go and buy the complete works of Schiller with the new edition. I think it was in 1819. And he immersed himself. He loved Joan of Arc. He loved that play. He loved Don Carlos. He said, sometimes I, like Don Carlos, am too hot-blooded. And he wrote that after he threw one of his best friends out of the house and threw his plate of food at him and said, never come back here. Then he went and wrote in his book, like Don Carlos, I may be too hot-blooded. And so he was struggling with this question of identity. And he came out of it. There are also some very interesting quotes where he talks about having this sense of being overwhelmed by destiny. In other words, that the society was corrupt, it was collapsing. I think I told you last night, one of the things he wrote was an article or a letter, where he said, actually it was a remembrance from one of his friends, that they came in when the first of the late quartets was played before one of the princes, and by the end of the evening, everyone had filed out except the prince and one of the court musicians. And so Beethoven turned around to see how they responded, and he saw a pretty much empty room. And one of the musicians said to him, "I fear that no one understands your writing." And he said, "It's not for them. It's for people to come." And who are those people to come? Who are the people who are going to figure out the late quartets? Well, Lynn has assigned that as a task for us. And Bruce has done some work on it, but I think it's the kind of thing that, as part of the overall music work, as you get more and more inside it, that's one of the things that I think remains as a task. Now, he had an incredible outburst of creative work near the end of his life, which included the Ninth Symphony. For those people who say, "Well, I worked on Kepler for 3 weeks and I didn't get it," I've been reading Riemann and it's taken me all day to get through the first 2 paragraphs. Think about Beethoven, who in 1793 started working on the Ode to Joy. And Fischenich, who was a friend of the Schillers, sent a letter to Charlotte Schiller saying, "I met a young musician who says he's going to set the Ode to Joy to music. As he is a most sublime person, I expect something great to come from this." And that was in 1793. The Ninth Symphony wasn't finished until almost 30 years later. And it took Beethoven years to decide the form to put it in. You see in 1804, 1809, I think again in 1819, different sketches and changes, and how he redid his idea of setting it to music. And then finally, he said, "Aha, we'll make a choral movement of a symphony." And the whole symphony is a one. It's a powerful, incredible piece where the opening of the 4th movement encapsulates the themes from the first 3 movements, as though he's saying, "Look, let me make it simple for you. This is revolutionary, but one of the aspects of the revolution is that the 4th movement flows directly. The idea of universal brotherhood, overcoming tragedy, you might say, is embodied in the writing of each of the first 3 movements." Now, this question of tragedy in music, and I'll just finish with this. Lynn threw out this provocative thing that the Opus 31 No. 2 was the first real tragic sonata of Beethoven. And so I was thinking, okay, where's the tragedy? And at one point, Lynn said, well, you go to measure 161, and between 161 and 186, that's where you see it. So I took the score, and I'm looking at it, and I said, man, this is a pretty dense part, but what does he mean by tragedy? Does it mean you're supposed to weep when you hear it? And what do you mean by the tragic in this? And it took a while to figure it out, and I'm still not sure I get it. But and Mihua is doing some work on this. But the point of this question of tragedy is actually the overcoming of tragedy, how you develop the mind so you can solve the kinds of problems that otherwise will lead to a sameness, being trapped in traditional forms that lead to the emotional and mental death. And so you overcome tragedy in music by challenging the sense certainty of the musicians and the audience, which is what Beethoven did. Now, in this period of his life in, I think, 1824, when he was working again on music, he wrote, "Only in my divine art do I find the support which enables me to sacrifice the best part of my life to the heavenly muses." And that's what Beethoven had as a self-conception. He lived for art, and the art was revolutionary in that it was a pathway of thinking which could allow for fundamental change in human society, the way out of tragedy. And so when you sing, it's not just a question of, am I going to hit the right notes? Can I place it right? I've got so much to think about. You've got to think about all that. But what you also should think about, and I think this was a real breakthrough, what Lynn saw as the breakthrough with Benauti, is that you're doing this to communicate ideas to an audience, not as a 12-step plan to get in good shape, or to improve your voice so your people like the way you sing more. But it's to increase those powers of creativity that allow for the communication of profound ideas. And so I think if you think about the potential we have here now, with the work that was done for the last 4 years, really. I mean, I was talking with a couple of people yesterday, and I was just reminiscing the dinner. I remember the dinner in Cambridge, where I just come through walking through Boston at the Democratic Convention. I'm sitting down for dinner with Lynn, and we're kicking around how screwed up Leesburg is. They couldn't get the pamphlets here. What are we going to do? The youth are stirring this place up. Terry McAuliffe is jumping up and down. He's all worked up. And then I said, well, Lynn, one of the things that strikes me is there are so goddamn many students in this town. We should have a local here. And he said, aha, I was waiting for someone to say that. And next thing you know, we had a local here. And under Lynn's direction, it took on a specific form with the music work. So it's not just that there was something 3 weeks ago, there was a breakthrough. There was a precondition for that many of you participated in, some more happily than others. But the work that's been done here leading into having Antonella Benauti come, now you've had that work. Now you've got a potential, a more clear mission. Now, does that mean Lynn said, do the following pieces and do it in the following ways? No, that's for you to decide. And that's for you to adopt as your divine art, as your mission, to be able to increase your power to communicate the ideas that are necessary to break society out of a tragic direction. So I think you sometimes should reflect back on people like Beethoven or Mozart or Verdi. You're working on their music. Think about their lives, what they did. These were not people who just sat down and scribbled out notes. These were people involved in battles. Beethoven consciously was trying to improve his country and the world. Mozart was trying to transform the world. He was a true revolutionary. Verdi was in the Italian Senate, and he was using his music to develop a sense of patriotism, but also overcome tragedy. So we go to their work, we develop it, and we use it to communicate ideas, not just narrowly in the music, but in our lives. And that's what Lynn's getting at. If you do that, you'll stay young. And you'll be an effective, absolutely indispensable part of human development. And that's how I think you have to look at the music. So those are a couple of comments I have before I get to see the wonderful work you're doing. So, by the way, thanks for having me, because it's been a great blast for me.
Thank you.